The first Sunday after the eruption, various of the congregation were not in church. This is understandable, you realize. Travel might have been impossible. Then the Tiburcio family simply vanished. The farm, as you had described, ravaged as by some giant being.
But there were no bodies.
Not until last Thursday. Since then, a young girl, she was crossing the fields to spend that night with some cousins, was found in the morning. Horrible. And the Dominguez brothers, ranchers, were discovered in the gully with that look of horror on their faces. And no blood.
It's small consolation, Father, I admit. But as a scientist, I know where the effects are so similar. There must be a simple, logical cause.
I wonder how simple, Dr. Ramos. Or how logical.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I'm your host, Ian Garcia, and joining me, as always, is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
This is our third week of giant bug movies, and this one, once again, is coming from Warner Brothers, who, of course, did Them, the original, the granddaddy of all the big bug movies in 1954. This episode is going to be on The Black Scorpion, which I think we can both admit, perhaps not as bad as Tarantula, but certainly a lesser big bug movie. Dad, you're still kind of hold a special affinity for the film, and I'd sort of like you to at least explain why that is, because I've seen this at least 3 times now, and I really can't find very much good to say about it.
It's really a shame that there's the stop action, and yet you're right. It's a terrible movie, not real terrible, but it's pretty bad. But nevertheless, there's something about that. There's something about the fact that they have gone to stop action instead of relying totally of large spiders superimposed on.
Well, there's a melding of special effect techniques that are used in the film. And I think it says something that there's at least 3 different techniques that are used to show the titular giant scorpions of the movie, none of which really gel with one another. You know, there's no sort of continuity between the way the scorpions look in any case. Now, obviously, there are some scenes in which they use a giant prop head or claw of the scorpion for close-ups, right, or scenes of people being ripped in its claws. There are some scenes
and stung. It's really I don't remember first of all, I have to say I think there was some editing when I saw it as a child or as a teenager.
That's possible. I mean, some of
scenes, brutal scenes in some of them.
In particular, the scene where the scorpion kills 2 telephone wire repairmen is fairly gruesome. Like, it gets one of them in its claws and blood is coming out of his mouth. I mean, fairly explicit for the time. The other way they achieve it is through the more popular method of the time, which is taking an actual scorpion and superimposing it as a mat over a pre-filmed live action scene, which I have to say is generally very poorly done.
Poor done.
The compositing of the scorpion is terrible, and
it's sometimes transparent.
Yeah, right? There's a semi-transparency to it. I think part of it might be just because the species of scorpion that they were working with were not black scorpions, because if you know, that's the weird thing, is that, like, it's called the black scorpion, but the scorpions used in the film are not black scorpions. If you've ever seen a black scorpion, they're very stout and broad,
they are
armored
right,
creatures,
right. They are.
And they sit very low to the ground. It seems that they decided to use smaller, perhaps less venomous, more easily wrangled scorpions that are actually more flesh-toned in color, simply because it was easier to, hold them up either by wires or prods on their, to hold them up, to coax them through a shot that they would then composite with the live action scenes. And it's not helped by the fact that there are several moments where they do artificial zoom shots onto the creature, so you see, so basically what I'm hypothesizing here is that the type of scorpion they used, because they weren't black scorpions, they had to use a post-processing of the film to basically, make a reverse or an inverse of the scorpion so that it appears black. So it's very blotchy, very lacking in detailed, semi-transparent, and then it's it's made worse by the fact that there will be occasionally these artificial zooms on the shot that they've prepared, which only makes the flaws in the composite even more apparent. And once you do an artificial zoom, basically, you're filming when you're doing an artificial zoom, you're filming a piece of film that's being projected. So when you're zooming in the artificial zoom, you're literally zooming even closer on the film cell. That makes the grain more apparent, so it's very obvious when the zoom is artificial, and obviously that results in a lack of detail. So that is generally really poorly done. And it needs to be said that because, of all the people who worked on the film, the only people who are really of note in a sort of big way in the history of American science fiction and fantasy adventure movies are the special effects, the creators of the stop motion animation effects for the film, which are Willis O'Brien, who of course did The Lost World, King Kong, Mighty Joe Young, and working under Willis O'Brien for this film was a protege of his named Pete Peterson, who worked with O'Brien and a young Ray Harryhausen on Mighty Joe Young previously, and later Pete Peterson would also work with O'Brien on The Giant Behemoth. In general, I think the stop motion sequences are fairly well done. It should be said that the stop motion sequences do not involve a lot of compositing of live action actors or the use of plates, where, there's not a lot of use of, what we see in something like King Kong, which is that they would animate a model, and while they're filming the animation of the model, they would have a rear projection of a live action component that is projected forward onto a glass plane, so that you could animate the model synchronized with the live action element. There's really generally not a lot of that in the picture. Most of the stop action is done with just full scale, or not full scale, but scale dioramas. And there are some particularly effective moments.
Going down in the cave, for example.
Yeah. In particular, I thought the scene where the scorpions attack a passenger train. I thought that was very effective. And that was also another moment of a particularly gruesome scene, because you're just watching tiny little people being held in the claws of the scorpions, and the scorpions just stinging down on the train while everybody is screaming in agony. Very harrowing stuff. I think some of the scenes where there is a scene, as Dad mentioned, where they descend into a kind of pit, and it's very reminiscent, this pit, of what is known as the Lost Spider Pit sequence, because originally in King Kong, after Kong throws those sailors off the log and into the cavern below, originally there was going to be an interstitial sequence in which the surviving sailors are eaten by a bunch of, cavern-dwelling monstrosities, including giant mollusks and insects. And apparently some of the models well, it's hypothesized that some of the models that are used here in Black Scorpion are actually repurposed from the Lost Spider Pit sequence. So there's the young boy character Juanito. He's being chased by what looks like a cave spider, but it really looks more like a giant tick. Very interesting design. I kind of liked of all the monsters in the Black Scorpion, I think I liked the giant tick more. Just because it just looks so awful and creepy, and
it looks very that's why I hate the more the startling part of it is the creepiness of the creatures. And they're just something creepy about them that makes, and that I think there are little touches in this that are, and that's it. That's where it falls apart because I mean, it's interesting. It's just it doesn't. I mean,
if anything, like that would have been where you had the climax of the movie. That would be the. That comes a midway through the picture.
Point. Very good
and if
point.
I'm making this movie, I'm saying, no, you save that part where the heroes descend into hell. You save that for the lowest point of the story, where that's where you reveal all the big monsters and stuff like that.
It would have been cool to do it that way instead of trying to do it like Ymir in the Rome in the middle of these things. And some people, and even the one where the animatronics are done
I think you definitely see the writing of the film. It's just kind of, I mean, I'm sure they didn't have a very long time to hammer out this screenplay, but like you see them it's sort of locked into a formula of what has worked before.
Yes.
That all giant monster movies before, all the way back to The Lost World with that great Brontosaurus rampaging through London sequence. They all crescendo with the moment where the monster reaches the city. You see that in King Kong. You see that with Godzilla. You see that with the beast from 20,000 Fathoms. You see it everywhere. I don't think that it necessarily worked for the Black Scorpion, but I think, of course, the other thing that's undermining the Black Scorpion is that in our episode of Them, where we sort of talked about the ways in which the Big Bug movie is kind of an appealing premise for a sci-fi horror is just because, there's a very natural predisposition to being repulsed by and scared of insects. But the problem is that it seems like insects are a lot scarier when they're smaller, when they're creeping up on you and when they're crawling near you, which I think is probably why that giant tick works much better. I think the fundamental thing is that like a giant scorpion, in as much as you're part of it is just the poor special effects that are used to achieve it when it's not stop motion. But at the end of the day, like even the stop motion animation of the giant scorpions, the scorpions are interesting because they're very complex and well animated characters, but they're not scary. And I think that's the fundamental problem, is that there's never really a sense of threat from the scorpion, because in the back of your mind, you're always saying, well, that's just a big bug. It's like, what's special about that? Yeah,
you're right. I mean, I agree 100% with that. The other thing is that the human element is lacking, at least in some of the movies. In them, you have a real story of, like you said, you take the bugs out of it and you have yourself a crime story.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right, and it has all the melodrama of a real of a crime story. Here you don't have anything at all. It's just a pastiche, and I agree with you. There's loosely arranged characters that it rolls along, but it isn't quite. I don't know. It doesn't hold together.
I mean, there's the buddy element between our stars, Richard Denning and Carlos Rivas.
And
there's the
not bad acting on their part.
There's the romantic element between Richard Denning and Mara Corday. But yeah, the script in general by Robert Blees and David Duncan, the script is generally pretty terribly written. The dialogue in particular, it's just forced. There's nothing really natural feeling about it.
Right, and even some of the scenes, there's no compelling interest in these characters.
Right.
You have no compelling interest in whether they survive or not. And when you have to force yourself to have a compelling interest, then there's a problem in the movie.
Yeah. I mean, it also comes down to the same thing as frequently the scientists, like these two geologists just end up doing things in the movie where fundamentally, again, in the back of your head, you're just wondering, wait, why are they the ones who are being tasked with doing this? They're just they're rock doctors.
Right,
Like, what
right.
possible, in a state of emergency, what possible use are they going to be? And that, I guess that's the other thing, is that, like, it really is funny the way in which, like, the unique, like, ideology of America at the time is that in the especially in this very chauvinist 1950s, even rock doctors need to be like Richard Dennings. They need to be these super handsome ladies men who are,
Right.
having dalliances with some in the hacienda of some Mexican Spitfire. There's like it's just one of those things where it's just like it's so weird and completely out of touch with anything like the social reality of who scientists actually are,
Right.
which is, as we all
Right.
know, they are men of deep neuroses and introversion, and that's precisely why they end up
That's right,
being good
scientists.
scientists,
Yes,
because
right.
they have an autistic focus on details rather than the sort of human emotion that it would take to seduce a Mexican aristocratic heiress.
Right. Heiress, yep.
I mean, yeah, and besides, Willis O'Brien, I mean, the guy who directed it, Edward Ludwig, he had never directed a science fiction or horror feature, and he didn't at any point after it. He was fairly old. He was 57 when he directed the movie, and I think it's safe to say that he doesn't really... I mean, I guess this reflects upon what we were talking about in terms of the idea that the era of the kind of science fiction or horror as a prestigious auteur genre is gone, and instead they're just kind of looking for competent technicians to quickly churn out these movies. Ludwig's direction, there's nothing really original about it. I think on some levels it's certainly better than Tarantula, which is surprising because I think Jack Arnold on balance is a much more expressive filmmaker. But yeah, there's nothing about the direction of the movie that particularly recommends it. David Duncan and Robert Blees, who wrote the screenplay, they had more of a grounding in science fiction, but again, they're sort of attached to science fiction in just a kind of churn it out kind of way.
But what's good about it is I like the idea that we don't have to worry about radiation or something we did. This is just a happenstance thing of being too close to nature, which is a very interesting element of its own, since today that seems to be the problem. Too much of an encroachment on nature, where now we're interacting directly with the problem of what can happen when even the unsuspected. And here it happens to be a volcanic activity that releases the beasts that were already down there, not due to radiation.
I suppose, except that's a case where it's not us encroaching upon nature. It's nature just by the whim of chaos encroaching on us.
Right. Well, we just happen to be, but yeah, right. I mean, exactly. It's Mexico. Right,
I should also say that one of the producers in the movie, Jack Dietz, he had previously produced The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms for Warner Brothers in 1953. So he's now joining up with Frank Melford for this independent production, which is then distributed by Warner Brothers. Do you want to just get into the plot synopsis, and then we'll...
I can't remember, but I think it just happens to the fact that it opens with the sequence of a volcanic eruption in Mexico.
Yeah, lots of stock footage. Right. Lots of stock.
And then using the mat of a caldera, of a volcano in the background, a smoldering caldera, and use that as and the mats weren't all that great. You can tell, some of the shots were pretty decent. Anyway, so that's the plot. And then
Dad, when I said, do you want to go into the synopsis, I mean I have one prepared.
Oh,
and
go
I'm
ahead.
Asking if you would just want to...
I see, it's rhetorical.
Yes, it is. I've done this several times, and you still aren't catching the net. Anyway, okay. "12 kilometers outside of San Lorenzo, Mexico, a pair of geologists, the American Dr. Hank Scott, played by Richard Denning, and a Mexican university professor, Dr. Arturo Ramos, played by Carlos Rivas, are on their way to survey a newly active volcano, the recent eruption of which has devastated much of San Lorenzo's farmland and cut off telephone contact to Mexico City. Scott and Ramos stop by a farmhouse for water, only to find much of the place destroyed, a damaged police cruiser, and a newborn baby seemingly abandoned, that night's dinner still cooking on the stovetop. They later find a deceased police officer petrified with a look of horror on his face and only a single piercing wound on the back of his neck. They arrive in San Lorenzo and meet Father Delgado, Pedro Galvan, who informs them that the destroyed farmhouse and the death of the police officer is but one of many mysterious disappearances and deaths that the superstitious citizens of San Lorenzo attribute to a legendary demon bull. Many of San Lorenzo's people, many already injured and displaced by the eruption, are pulling up stakes and leaving for Mexico City with the help of the military and the Red Cross, of course. The next morning, Scott and Ramos make for the volcano. Along the way, they meet the very beautiful Teresa Alvarez, played by the very American Mara Corday, after she is thrown from her horse. In the meantime, Ramos discovers a bit of obsidian, cooled lava released from deep in the earth by the recent eruption. Scott and Ramos escort Alvarez back to San Lorenzo, where she rallies the cowpunchers to return to her family ranch and hacienda at Miraflores. Scott and Ramos learn from the local physician, Dr. Jose de la Cruz, played by Pascual Garcia Peña, that the police officer they found that night was killed by a lethal dose of an unknown organic poison, samples and slides of which he has sent to be identified by the renowned Dr. Velasco in Mexico City. He also shows them a casting of a giant clawed footprint from the scene of the incident. Ramos and Scott spend the night at Miraflores. While Scott is putting the moves on Alvarez, Ramos does something actually useful and discovers that the obsidian he found contains a still living scorpion inside, preserved for centuries. Not long after, a much bigger scorpion appears and lays siege first to Miraflores and then to San Lorenzo itself, seemingly undeterred by even the Mexican military's steel-piercing rounds, consuming all of the city's livestock and several people. The next morning, Dr. Velasco, Carlos Musquiz, I don't know how to pronounce that, he arrives from Mexico City and gives Ramos, Scott, and Major Cosio of the Mexican military the lowdown on what you probably already figured out when you bought your ticket, that the giant scorpion is a prehistoric giant from a bygone era. Velasco says it's from the Triassian period, which I assume he means Triassic period. This is probably one of those acromegalia flourishes to which screenwriters in a hurry are prone.
No, I'm sorry. It could be the tertiary period.
No, he means, he says Triassian.
Okay, maybe it's Triassic.
He's clearly referring to the Triassic period.
I was going to say, what?
Yeah. And that was also just not, it's like, obviously there were, of course, giant insects during at the times when the planet was more oxygen rich, but obviously a creature like a scorpion as big as the one in this movie couldn't exist because it literally couldn't physically support itself. It's like, right. There's not enough oxygen to make something like a insect that big, or an arachnid rather.
Right.
They hatch a plan to find the rift out of which the scorpions emerged, intending to gas them and blow up the hole to seal them off forever. The void is so large that poison gas will dissipate, so that nixes that part of the plan. And of course, that's just reused from them. That's the same plan that they intend to use in the Giant Ant movie. Anyway, Scott and Ramos suit up to be lowered down by crane into the cavern to see how deep it is. I don't know. But who should stow away aboard the rig but one of Alvarez's servants, the precocious little orphan boy Juanito, played by Mario Navarro, who is surely an appreciated addition to the diverse and colorful cast of Black Scorpion.
Right, but he should have learned his lesson from the other movie, right?
Yeah.
He's a Hollow Mountain.
Yeah. Anyway, the cavern is crawling with all kinds of giant prehistoric bugs, including several giant prehistoric scorpions. In particular, there is one really giant black scorpion that seems to bully all the others. We see it grappling with and stinging the vulnerable underside just below the head of one of the smaller ones, which is how Scott and Ramos discover the scorpion's one vulnerable spot. They get out in the nick of time, and Major Cosio just has the opening blown all to hell. Anyway, Ramos and Scott finish up their survey, and in the 2 days they have before Alvarez has to go to America to buy cattle, they all decide to go to Mexico City, where Scott and Alvarez can continue their wooing of one another. No sooner do they arrive in the city, Dr. Velasco and some military and government types request Scott and Ramos's audience. Turns out that there was recently discovered a dead scorpion trying to surface quite close to Mexico City, indicating that the giants have merely escaped and traveled by means of underground caverns.
Right.
Indeed, a bunch of scorpions resurface near the city and destroy a passenger train, while many of the smaller surviving scorpions fight amongst each other for the human spoils. The really big one decides to just kill all the rest of them, which is all very convenient. It makes its way to Mexico City proper, makes a good mess of things, but the good guys hatch a plan to draw the monster to a stadium where Scott shoots an electrified harpoon into its weak spot, and that's Buenas noches, Black Scorpion. So obviously among the names that I mentioned from the cast, Carlos Rivas, Mario Navarro, and Pascual Garcia Pena, all of those actually appear later that year in another sort of American-Mexican co-production, The Beast of Hollow Mountain. Carlos Rivas obviously plays the rival of the American character, the romantic and business rival of the American character in The Beast of Hollow Mountain. Mario Navarro is the annoying child character in that movie as well. He plays the son of Pascual Garcia Pena, who plays a sort of drunk cow puncher who rides a donkey around. You do see in both The Black Scorpion and The Beast of Hollow Mountain the sort of, there's this way in which that, science fiction movies of this period occasionally chase complementary trends in B-movie filmmaking. And around this point in the 50s, there's sort of this renewed interest in either setting or filming movies in Mexico or doing American-Mexican co-productions. I think a lot of that is sort of reflective of a kind of post-war move to normalize political and economic relationships with Mexico. I think it's interesting, though, that I think what you can say for The Black Scorpion, which you can't really say for The Beast of Hollow Mountain, and I should say that all of these actors, all of the Mexican and Spanish actors in the film, they all had substantial careers in Mexican national cinema at the time. But when it comes to Carlos Rivas and Pascual Garcia Pena in particular, I think it's interesting comparing the sorts of ways in which Mexico is portrayed in The Beast of Hollow Mountain versus the way it's portrayed in The Black Scorpion. Because The Beast of Hollow Mountain is a much more sort of provincial and romanticized depiction of Mexico, right, which is to say that the Mexican characters are much more stereotypical, I think,
right,
and the plot is a lot more problematic. Because effectively the plot of The Beast of Hollow Mountain is just that this Yankee comes south and not only undercuts the business of a Mexican cattle rancher played by Carlos Rivas, but also attempts to basically steal his woman out from under him. There's this whole element to The Beast of Hollow Mountain where it's so strange that that it takes the position of the outsider, whereas the Mexican, and obviously there's that whole element of the sort of stereotypical portrayal of Mexicans as sort of spitfires, as kind of, super passionate people who are motivated by
right,
deep...
proud people.
Yeah.
But somewhat primitive.
Yeah.
But also exotic. I think what it shows,
right.
I think what you talked about is a very interesting point. Mexico being portrayed, maybe that's the reason, sort of almost like a forbidden or unknown area of the world, where in the United States it feels like it's pretty much stayed and, there's not much to be discovered. But Mexico, so it offers like an appeal that these other parts of the world have more primitive nature to them that could hatch these kinds of creatures.
Right. Maybe not primitive, but certainly there's a kind of, and you do see it in the beginning of The Black Scorpion where, the opening, the obligatory stock footage laden opening with the narrator with the booming voice talking about this devastating volcano. It is as much about the superstitious nature of the rural Mexican peasants as it is about the destruction of the volcano, because it's referring to them praying to God to stop the devastation. They're not. It's a portrayal of them as not a modern people. It's portraying them as a people who are more or less completely beholden to the whims of nature.
For centuries, the prayers of Mexico's peasants have been their only shield against the devastating furies that have wrecked their homes and destroyed their lives. And so today, again they kneel, terrified and helpless, as a new volcano is created by the mysterious and rebellious forces of nature.
And and that's the thing, is that like in the first half hour of the movie, there's a lot made of the superstition, like they believe that the deaths are caused by a big demon bull. But again, like the superstition angle of the movie never really goes anywhere. It just sort of is there. And so there's this aspect of it that is kind of stereotypical. But overall, The Black Scorpion, on balance, takes a much more modern perspective of Mexico, because the Mexicans we saw in The Beast of Hollow Mountain, they were
more Western,
they were more Western. They were all either cow punching, sombrero wearing peasants,
or aristocracy,
especially Pascual Garcia Pena. He's probably the most stereotypical one in the film because he's literally just a drunkard who rides a burro. It's a very sort of stereotypical image. And if they're not the peasantry, they are, again, the super passionate aristocracy, the very exotic ruling class. Whereas what we see, even in San Lorenzo in the movie, what we don't just see a bunch of superstitious poor Mexicans. What we see is a modern Mexican military and the Red Cross responding to an emergency crisis. There's no part of the movie where like the American military is recruited to help deal with the problem. Mexico is able to competently respond to this natural disaster.
But there's an attaché in the opening scene from America who talks to the guys. I said, where did you actually see this and things like that? He's brought in from America as an advisor, I think, or something like that.
Well, not the opening scene.
Not the opening. I'm sorry. The later on, the second, before they identified the fact that there was a black scorpion found. So he's the one that he's the one that actually does the dictation when he says, "Please sit down, gentlemen, and watch the."
I don't know that he's supposed to be an American attaché because the actor seems to be either Mexican or an American. I think that actor might be a Mexican. Like, I don't think.
But he had no accent, and he spoke complete English.
He spoke English, but like it seemed like if he is an American actor, he's certainly forcing a poor accent. I mean, it's like the.
No, maybe you're right. Right. Because it's Hector Mateos. Maybe you're right.
The thing is that whereas Pascual Garcia Pena, whereas he's playing a kind of drunk, indigent father in The Beast of Hollow Mountain, here he's playing a local physician. And there's he
still likes tequila.
Yeah, he still likes his tequila. There's still a very hacky bit that's made about it in the film. But at the end of the day, he's ultimately portrayed as a very modern and competent person who is actually essential in helping the heroes of our film get the information they need. Like he's a very small part of the film, but he's an essential part of the patchwork in terms of identifying, diagnosing, and solving the problem. And of course, Velasco is presented even more so as a very educated, very modern
Mexico City University.
Right. So it is interesting that the movie does open with this booming voice that is all about, the poor plight of the superstitious Mexican peasant. But then what the movie ends up being about is really an homage of sorts to modern Mexico. And I guess in a sort of implicit way, an homage to Mexico as after the normalized economic and diplomatic relationships with the United States. There's this there is this sort of sense that, like,
there's hegemony by
right.
acceptance, and
right?
not by
Exactly.
force.
Which of course is perfect, because now instead of Richard Denning and Carlos Rivas, now instead of them being romantic rivals, now they are two fellow scientists who are meeting together to both do this survey together. And if anything, Carlos Rivas proves to be a much more studious and attentive scientist than Richard Denning, where the moment he sees Maricorde, immediately he's completely ignoring his duties.
You know how this is done symbolically? It's done symbolically in the scene where they find her. She falls off the horse, and what does the Mexican...
Well, no, so, like, let me set it up, because people are going to be confused, and they're not going to know what you're talking about.
In the scene when they first see her, right, go ahead.
Right, in the scene where they first see her, they're arriving at the volcano.
Richard
Denning, Dr. Scott, he's looking through his binoculars. He sees Maricorde Alvarez riding her horse across the cliff. He hands the binoculars to Carlos Rivas. He hands the binoculars to Ramos. But when Ramos looks, she's already fallen from her horse, so he just sees the horse.
Yeah.
Oh, si, senor. Here, have a look. It'll do you a lot more good than that bottled water.
Oh, yes. Now I see them.
Oh, Doc, you haven't got that thing in focus.
They're focused. And it's a very handsome horse, and I'd like to get started, Hank.
Horse? There was a girl on that horse. Come on. We've got to get started and find her.
Yeah, I mean, like, and that's the thing, is that, like, none of these things are, like, they don't add up to a very good story, but they do make the Black Scorpion kind of interesting as a time capsule of what is sort of, again, it's sort of the implicit political background of a lot of American movies at the time, which is being heavily informed by this, by a very a kind of sort of conscious, semi-conscious effort to present our immediate neighbor to the south as being a part of exactly what you say, this new hegemony when it comes to scientific advancement. And obviously there is that dichotomy that's presented in the film between the superstitious and provincial San Lorenzo versus the very modern and educated Mexico City.
It's very interesting. I worked with scientists from Mexico City. They came to our local university occasionally. They would come up and do research with us. And even in the 1980s, they thought that when they came to the United States and worked in our research laboratories, they thought they had the candy store. They had to repurify their radioactivity to use for various experiments as tags, and where we were able to buy fresh radioactivity all the time. Right. It's very interesting how even back then in the modern Mexico City, at the university there, those people that came into really looked upon the United States as still this plethora of a bounty.
Well, that's kind of the way we've arranged it, and I mean that's the sort.
No, I meant to say the fact that you're right, but the idea is that the University of Mexico City, they're still pretty poor, even though it's a remarkable university and they educate a good population of people. But I think you hit upon something important here. I just think that symbolic gesture there points out the thing that you just mentioned, it's interesting that there's an allowance for the American scientist to have these urges and have these ellipses.
He's almost on vacation, where everyone else is on business.
Whereas Arturo Ramos is actually the scientist. He's focused,
right.
and he's not focused in the sense of being blind. He just doesn't care. I mean, he cares, but he smiles a little bit, and he laughs and chuckles, and he's okay with him. He's all you Americans. You're all. It's
Yeah,
kind
it's
of
almost it's almost like a
reverse.
it's a reversing of the polarity of
Yeah.
stereotypes, because traditionally it's supposed to be the Mexicans who are more
Like
passionate,
like you just said.
whereas in
Yeah.
this case it's Richard Denning who is the one who is consumed by passions, and
Yeah.
it's the Mexican characters who are all really super rational and about their business.
Right, focused. And it's a shame, right? It's a shame that all that stuff is buried in the rest of a poorly written script. Nothing's developed beyond that.
Right.
I mean, you're absolutely right, but there are pieces or little symbols that can be teased out, and it just get lost in this film. It's really a shame. It really is a shame. I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you.
No, I mean, like, and I'm trying not to like just repeat a point. I'm just trying to like, because, I mean, there is that sort of, I mean, it is that sort of element, isn't it? Because the movie, in that sort of understated way, is a part of this project of normalizing these relationships,
Blurring the distinctions, right?
Yeah, blurring the distinctions,
Right.
And ultimately in the political background of it, in the service of what is ultimately going to bear out to be a very hyper exploitative relationship.
Yes.
I mean, it's
cheap
like
labor.
Yeah, not just cheap labor, the extraction of raw materials. I
Mhm.
mean, the use of Mexico more or less
Right.
as a gateway to
Well,
the rest of South America.
And also the soft drink industry.
Yeah, I mean,
they what they did is they took away. They took, for example, most recently during the previous administration, they refused to allow the physicians and the head of ministries down in South America, and also in cases of Mexico, from talking about the obesity problem with soft drinks and putting warning labels,
Right.
and education. They
Yeah,
were going to take out the $120 billion that we're offering them for other type of aid if they were to do that.
And it should
So
be
you're
said,
right.
like, those were policies that were normalized, that were made official under Trump, but were in the works for a long time. Like,
Yes.
it is
Yeah,
true.
no, it's true. You're
like,
right.
you
Yes.
know, corporations, or at least, you know, transnational corporations, but especially ones that are sort of centered in American commodity. It's not just a situation where they extract things. There's this very hyper dependent relationship that we now coerce with Central and South America, where we've now reached the point where, like, in some countries we literally have, like, you know, effectively trade deals with them where you tie the hands of these countries, so even if they wanted to regulate these industries that are promoting, you know, poor quality food, obesity, or malnutrition in their populations, even if you wanted to regulate them nationally, we more or less have a situation in which the corporations always have a seat at the table in writing the regulations, which is something we have here in the United States too.
Right.
But the imbalance of power is a lot starker there. And
It is. Yeah.
you know, I was even thinking about when you were talking about the your colleagues in the 80s coming over and being sort of amazed by the prosperity of the sciences in America. You know, especially in the 80s, that was only a few years after the sort of signal crisis of the gas crisis, right? The first sort of major international financial crisis that led to the beginning of the sort of the broken promise of neoliberal capital, the eventual point at which the signal crisis, the singularity at which finally the rate of profit began to decline. Once it becomes apparent, you know, there are no more venues left to exploit. There are no more margins to be cracked open. And so the deep sort of immiseration that Mexico experiences, like, I think in the 1950s, it was probably easier to make these sort of optimistic movies about a new modernized South America, because I suppose in some ways it was probably easier to sell the fiction that, that there was at least some prosperity that was, obviously it wasn't being equally distributed.
Mm-hmm.
It was concentrated among the emergent middle class, especially the cosmopolitan middle classes throughout Central and South America.
Mm-hmm.
But you can see these movies, especially like something like The Black Scorpion, as sort of a time capsule referring back to a period where there was more optimism about this idea that this prosperity, the post-war miracle that had come to America, was going to trickle down in a sense to Central and South America.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. And this film sort of like shows that almost like there's no difference. And it shows a little bit of an equation.
Right, because there are no characters in it, so the stand-ins for the American hegemony become the Mexican military and the Mexican politicians. It's like there's no, yeah.
Like I said, there are little pieces, and the more we talk about the film, there are little pieces to it that that are really good, but they get lost.
They're interesting, but they're not really substantiated or supported by the film.
Right, and it could have been a very symbolic film. It could have done a pretty good, decent job if the through line was somehow put together a little better.
Yeah, I mean, in this, in the decades since it was made, it sort of has become symbolic in the way that any movie that is going to be about, giant insects emerging from the fiery yonic pits of the earth is going to have like a sort of symbolic, connotation to it. It becomes like The Birds, where it's like, okay, so does Richard Denning show up, and are the scorpions sort of like a bleak prophecy of what America is bringing to Mexico? Is all of this modernity that is supposed to help Mexico, is it actually manifesting this demon bull of capitalism that is going to come and just ravage the countryside and extract and destroy all the resources, lay the farmland to waste? I made the joke in the Beast of Hollow Mountain episode that, like, the happy ending of the movie is that once the bad, intolerant, xenophobic Mexican character is gotten rid of, then the American transplant can finally get to work of engineering, like the North American Free Trade Agreement.
That's right.
It's like it like there's. And I'm sorry, it's like
selling cattle,
selling
horses to whatever. Yeah,
and part of that is just my broke materialist brain.
I know, that's right.
But
cool.
like I do end up I increasingly see it in these movies, because at the end of the day, Black Scorpion, the monster itself, is very much this kind of, there's a reason there is a reason that the background of superstition is there. And it's because, this primordial monster needs to be conflated with the superstition. The monster of the Black Scorpion itself is something that is literally underneath. It's in the underground of Mexican culture. So in a weird way, there's almost this element of the movie where the destruction of the scorpion is symbolic of the need to basically destroy the problematic Mexican culture, all of these provincial ties, all of these ties to the land, all of this superstition, basically all of the things that make, like, Mexico actually interesting.
Yep.
And, all of the conventional social bonds that, created a sense of unity and a sense of purpose. That thing needs to be destroyed to make way for the new order of the cosmopolitan modernity.
Yeah, and we still do. We find some of the places in Mexico on the coasts are still, I want to say, they're visited but ravaged by American tourists that flock there in huge numbers and we continue to. It really is a sin almost. I mean, if there were such, I'm not really a religious person, but it really comes down to that. It's just, and we go there, and yet we have a certain detachment from what our relationships are with Mexico in terms
because
of
we're not taught what actually happened.
Right.
Like we're taught that Mexico is poor and riven with political corruption, We're not told that the reason Mexico is poor is because there's just like a vacuum tube that is just sucking natural resources and capital out of Central and South America and putting it into the United States. We just accept these relationships as normal. And I think what the Black Scorpion pretends in that sort of relationship, that dichotomy.
I'm sorry, in 56, there wasn't much known about it at that point, though. It wasn't really started at that point yet. We didn't have factories in Mexico City.
Well, no, it's not about. But it's not about the factory.
The hegemony I'm talking about.
The hegemony is already there, and it's already beginning. You still mostly have in South and Central America a kind of like an almost like protection racket of the of South America. Because as it's like, I mean, it's more pronounced in countries like, Guatemala or Venezuela or Cuba especially. Cuba especially is the big one looming over everything, where here is this place, just a few miles off the coast of Florida, which during the time that the Black Scorpion is being made is literally like a gangster capitalist paradise. It is just a resort for every kind of the most craven exploitation, the worst kind of socioeconomic inequality. Cuba is the prediction of the deleterious, inevitable endpoint of any relationship that a South American or Central American country is going to have with the United States. With Mexico, again, like, I think probably there was this hope of a more evenly distributed prosperity, but at the end of the day, it's like the joke we keep making is that the true monster is man. But, from my broke brain Marxist perspective, the true monster is capitalism. That, the face of the Black Scorpion in that close-up shot of this voracious black creature with its literal gullet, under its throat. Double-chinned and expanding with air.
And white.
Right. The intention is supposed to be that this creature represents the subaltern, the thing that's inconvenient about South American social bonds and traditions that are a threat to capitalism, specifically because it's a threat to this new alienated conception of the world merely being one of a web of transactions of competitive individuals. It's supposed to represent the threat to modernity, but ultimately the Black Scorpion reveals itself as just, America staring into the void and seeing a manifestation of itself. It is what Richard Denning brought with him. Richard Denning came to San Lorenzo in order to, really as a sex tourist. Like, he's there to study rocks, but immediately he goes to the first attractive Mexican woman he sees. And then what happens is a creature with a giant phallic stinger comes out of the ground and immediately just starts destroying people. The true monster is a man, but the true monster is also white capitalist men at the end of the day.
Anyway, like I said, there are some very interesting, I think we highlighted some of those, and some of the symbolism, whether it was, how do you say it? Whether it wasn't planned.
No, none of this is intentional.
Again, it's not intentionally done, but we pick out things that looks pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. It's like we're looking through the veil of time, and we have a diamond. We sort of have like a diamond eyeglass in which we can see projected onto the film screen the unconscious of the people who made this movie in a way that is far starker and more horrific than they ever could have conceived. Because how could they have known?
No.
How could they have known?
No.
As far as they were concerned, they probably were just thinking, we're just making a movie that's set in an interesting locale. We'll have these Mexican characters. It's like, it was an American Mexican.
How much did it make, do you know? And who got the profits? Did they split it with Mexico?
I don't, that's the thing. I don't think it was a official American Mexican co-production. I don't think the movie itself was super profitable. I mean, like, that's the thing, is that, like, it's hard to find information on specific profits for these kinds of movies. I mean, I can't imagine that it lost money. I mean, it wasn't like it was terribly expensive. Yeah, that's the thing, is that, like, even that's another way of looking at it. Like, even the film itself, like, obviously there's a tremendous Mexican-American performer presence in the movie.
Right.
But that's another way of looking at it. It's like, is even the film itself like an extractive enterprise?
Right. You
It's
took
like
the
we're
human capital.
right, exactly. We're just gonna get a bunch of like, it's like these Mexican extras. We can afford to pay them a lot less than we could American SAG actors going for union rates.
What about Beast of Hollow Mountain? Just to go back to, was that a
That was an
Mexican?
American-Mexican co-production. Yeah, we had talked about that. Like, there was even a Spanish language version of it that was shot by a guy who would end up go on to be a very prominent Mexican
That's right. You told me that. That's
director.
Right. That's right.
So the Beast of Hollow Mountain, I would say like the Beast of Hollow Mountain, it's got its problems, but I think it's at least a more interesting, colorful movie than the Black Scorpion. So if I'm going to recommend an
enterprise,
an Amex horror or science fiction movie, I'm going to go with the Beast of Hollow Mountain. Yes, and I think like that is more interesting in terms of the history of the relationship between American and Mexican film industry. Here, it's just like, it's like some good actors, and again, we do need to acknowledge that for the time, these actors were actually given some pretty meaty, substantial roles in this movie that were non-stereotypical. And that, to me at least, that counts for something. That was something where I didn't see it immediately when I was watching the movie. And again, I've seen it 3 times, and it really never occurred to me that, like, oh, wow, this is actually pretty nice. Mexicans who aren't portrayed as, just wailing, sombrero, sporting, bandolero vested, savages, like they're actual diverse human people. Right. And I think that that's a reflection of the time in which it was made, in which there is this sort of, again, this normalization not only of diplomatic and economic relationships, but also a kind of new fad of fascination with Mexico, more tourism to Mexico, more people sort of becoming enamored with Mexico as a budding, complementary, like sort of like America's poor younger brother. Like that's sort of the conception of Mexico that you see in films like The Black Scorpion. I think that's as good a place to leave it.
Yeah,
we're going to finish out our big bug month by going back to Universal. We'll be talking about the Deadly Mantis. And if I can, I'm going to try to put out a bonus episode. And with that, I want to take a look at a more modern attempt to do a big bug movie. Now, obviously,
Monster Green Hell?
No, Dad, a more modern one.
Oh,
like as in a more recent. Right. Like, obviously, American independent and exploitation filmmakers never stopped rehashing the same old junk formulas from the movies of the 1950s. But I didn't want to do like a direct-to-video, like Sci-Fi Channel original movie, giant bug movie. So I decided that what might be a good idea for a bonus episode. Dad, do you remember a little movie called 8-Legged Freaks? I'm going to presume the answer is no.
I can't remember.
I think that's okay. I don't think a lot of people remember 8-Legged Freaks, and that's probably for a good reason.
Okay.
But stay tuned for all that and more on Monster Craze Memoirs.